Ready to go.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon, guys. I'm really excited that you have joined us for our second TEA collaboration webinar. This one is Students' Rights under IDEA for Behavioral Incidents and Discipline. And we're going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. I'm Megan Sanders. I'm the Training and Evaluation Specialist for Partners Resource Network, and joining me today is Ms. Christina Henning, who is our Director of Statewide Services. So Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates a statewide network of parent training and information centers. We have the PATH Project, the PIN Project, and the TEAM Project. We are federally funded from a grant from Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, known as OSEP. We provide training and education, information, and referrals, as well as technical assistance and emotional support for parents of children with disabilities birth to 26 years of age. So joining us today from TEA is Ms. Deanna Clemens. So I will introduce her, and then I'll pass the mic over to her to get started. So Deanna Clemens serves as a manager of the technical assistance team within the Division of Special Education at the Texas Education Agency. She is a nationally certified school psychologist. She's a licensed specialist in school psychology and a board-certified behavior analyst. Deanna received her education specialist degree in school psychology from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. She practiced for several years as a K-12 school psychologist in Pennsylvania, and since relocating to Texas in 2009, Deanna has held public school positions as Adaptive Behavior and Autism Program Specialist, Coordinator of Special Services, and Special Education Coordinator for Behavior Services. She joined TEA in August of 2017 and served as a Program Specialist for Child Find and Evaluation and low incidence disabilities on the technical assistance team before becoming a team manager. So welcome, Deanna. I will pass it over to you now.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about behavioral rights and discipline with you guys today. It's kind of a meaty topic, so we'll try to break it down as much as we can in the hour and go through some information that hopefully will clarify some things. And then at the end, I've provided some resource links that are really nice links to either interactive flowcharts or some websites that will go over kind of the same content in another format, so you can see it presented in different ways. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about disciplinary removals, manifestation determination reviews, or MDRs, as you might hear them called in schools. Talk a little bit about restraint procedures, and then I'll show you some resources that I've put together at the end. So first off, disciplinary removals. So what is a disciplinary removal? It's basically just any time that a student violates the student code of conduct and is, because of that violation, removed from their current placement and put in another setting. It could be suspension, it could be in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, it could even be if the student is expelled. One of the questions that were submitted was, what about if it's for a partial day? Portions of the school day would count for removals. Typically, they're counted in half-day increments. And then suspensions from the bus would also be considered removals if the student has bus transportation as part of their IEP. So if transportation to school is in the IEP and they're, say, suspended from the bus, then that would count as a removal. If bus transportation is not part of the IEP, then a suspension from the bus would not count as a removal. So let's talk about we're going to talk about the different types of removals for school. So in school suspension, this question gets asked a lot. When I was in district, it was a common question. In school suspension, so that's when a student is suspended from school, but they're not sent home. Their suspension happens in the school building, typically in some sort of ISS room, in school suspension classroom. And so the question is always, do those removals count as a day of removal? The answer is a little bit complicated. So if while the student is in school suspension, if they're given these 3 bullets in blue, if they have the opportunity to continue to participate in the general curriculum, if they continue to receive the services in the IEP, and if they continue to be able to participate with children who do not have children, if they continue to be able to participate with their general education peers to the extent they would in their normal placement, if all three of those things are satisfied, then the in-school suspension does not count as a day of removal. If those things are not counted, then it is a day of removal. So here's an example that I've seen in schools before. Sometimes a school administrator would want to say, I'm doing 2 days of in-school suspension for the student for violating something in the student code of conduct. I'm going to do 2 days of in-school suspension, but they say those in-school suspension days are going to happen in the behavior support classroom, which is a special education setting. And the student normally does not spend their whole day in the behavior support classroom. So in that case, that would have to count as a day of removal because the student is not accessing the general education peers or environment to the extent that they would normally. So ISS in a special education setting would count as a day of removal. If the ISS is able to happen in a general education setting, like an ISS classroom where kids that are general ed and special ed go, and they receive all their services, and they're able to participate in the general ed curriculum, then that day might not count as a day of removal. So it gets a little complicated with ISS. Sometimes you'll hear schools use a term called SMART ISS, which isn't a real thing, but it is something that schools talk about. And usually what they mean is that they're trying to make sure that in that ISS setting that they're ensuring that those three things happen so that the day does not count as a day of removal. So in general, when there's removals, a student, the first 10 days, I should say, the first 10 days that a student is removed, they are not, the school is not required to provide any IEP services. So if you're given a 3-day out of school suspension, and that's the first out of school suspension you've had, then that student is not entitled or required to receive any of their services. They're not entitled to FAPE during that removal. Those are generally, any removal under 10 days is considered a short-term removal. But sometimes you can have short-term removals that enough of them add up to where they're considered a long-term removal. And we're going to talk about those rules more. But the big message from this slide is that before you get to 10 days cumulative, all added up, there are no requirements for IEP services to be provided during those first 10 days of removal. So if you have a 2-day out of school suspension and then a 3-day and then another 2-day, like until you get to 10, there's not a requirement for IEP services to be implemented. And in those first 10 days, the school can provide the same kind of discipline that they would to a non-disabled student for violations of the student code of conduct. Where it starts to get into where parents and students have procedural rights under the IDA is when we're talking about removals after the first 10 days. So there's longer term removals or removals that you end up getting several short term that add up to be more than 10. So after those first 10, so we said the first 10, no IDEA procedures apply, but after the first 10 in one school year, the school has to consider if it becomes a change of placement. And there's another slide where we're going to talk about what are the rules around deciding if it's a change of placement. But regardless, once they get past 10 days of removal, then IEP protections kick in where the student is required to have services. So there are some IEP services that have to be provided once they get past that first 10 days. Sometimes schools will call those first 10 days FAPE-free zone, meaning that for the first 10 days of removal, there's no obligation to provide FAPE. Once you get past the first 10 days, then there is an obligation to provide some services. And that third bullet here is about, well, who decides what the services that are provided? It's actually the school in consultation with a teacher determines what services are needed so that the student can continue to participate in the gen ed curriculum and progress towards meeting their IEP goals. Those are for removals after the 10 days. The other big consideration for once you get past the first initial 10 days is whether it's a change of placement. So when a student has a change of placement, that could be they're assigned to the DAP, something that they're going to be in, like an alternative ed setting. Maybe they're assigned for 30 days or something like that. Or if they've had multiple of those short-term removals that are now adding up to be more than 10, and they constitute a pattern of removals. And we're going to talk through that in the next slide. But basically, you have short-term removals, which are small amounts of time that do not go past 10 days. And then you have removals that are considered a change of placement, like the DAP. And when you have the short-term removals that add up to be a potential change of placement, these are the 5 things that have to be considered in determining whether a combination of short-term removals equals a change of placement. So sometimes it gets oversimplified to say that once you add up to 10 days, it's automatically a change of placement, but that's not really true. It is, once you get to 10 school days in one school year, it might be a change of placement, but there's 4 other considerations. So the first one is, has the student been removed for a total that is more than 10 days? And are the behaviors for those short-term removals similar, substantially similar to each other? So if you have 3 days for fighting, another 3 days for fighting, and you have all these removals that are all really around the same kind of issue, then that's clearly a pattern. Where it gets more complicated is if you have a couple of removals that are about the same type of behavior, but then you have some removals that don't seem to be related. Maybe a student brings something like cigarettes to school and they get a 3-day suspension, but then their other removals are for tardies. I'm just giving some examples that it's like hard to see how those things are related. So the removals need to be a pattern that the incidents relate to each other. So more than 10 days, there's a pattern, more than 10 days and they're similar to each other. And other considerations are the length of each removal, the total amount of time the student's been removed, and how close in time their removals are to each other. So those are the factors that are considered in determining whether or not a series of short-term removals is a change in placement. And the reason that's really important is because a change of placement has implications for what schools have to do when it's a change of placement. So, and how the school can, it's really on a case-by-case basis that the school determines if a series of short-term removals are a change of placement. And they, they analyze those 5 factors in determining whether they have to then go through the procedural rights, the procedural processes for when a change of placement occurs. So what happens if there's a change of placement? Either they're ordering a long-term removal, which is something that's more than 10 days at one time, or they have a series of removals that add up to be a change of placement. What a district has to do is that they must notify the parents of the discipline on the date the decision is made to assign discipline that removes the student and would be a change of placement. So parents have to get their procedural safeguards, and parents have to be notified on the date that the decision is made for a discipline removal that is a change of placement. And then before any discipline action can be taken that is a change of placement, a manifestation determination review must be conducted. So they have to do a manifestation determination, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next section. So I'm going to show you guys this video from SpedTex. I think it's a really nice job of just a short video that talks about manifestation determinations. Hopefully it works. It's a special education information center. It's a call center and parent and resource center that is funded by Texas Education Agency. They have a series of videos. One of them is just a couple-minute clip about manifestation determinations. That's a nice little short video to watch If you know that you're going to be going into a manifestation ARD, it's a nice little reminder of kind of what to expect and what happens in those meetings. But we're going to be talking about it in the slides anyway. But that's just a little resource that I wanted to share and show you guys. So basically, whenever the school is proposing a discipline placement that is a change of placement, they have 10 school days to have a manifestation determination. This is the ARD committee. It's parents and other members of the ARD committee who come together to hold this meeting where they talk about if the behavior if the incident that is triggering the change of placement is a manifestation of the student's disability. And there's two questions. Basically, the questions are, the first one, was the behavior caused by, or did it have a direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability? And the second question is, was the behavior a direct result of the school's failure to implement the student's IEP? So is the behavior caused by or a direct result of the disability, or was the behavior the result of the school's failure to implement the student's IEP? So those are the two questions that team is charged with answering at that manifestation determination review. So what happens when those questions, so the team's gonna look at the student's record, they're gonna have information about the incident, information from parents, they're gonna go through and look at the information and data they have to answer those questions. If the answer to either question is yes, so if they say, yes, this behavior was caused by the disability, or yes, this behavior was the result of the school's failure to implement the IEP, then they have to do a functional behavioral assessment, unless one has already been done, in which case it may just be reviewing the behavior intervention plan. And they have to return the student to the placements unless there's a special circumstances. So basically, if you say, yes, it was a manifestation, then the discipline removal does not happen. And the student goes back to the setting that they were in, and then there's revisions to the behavior plan or an FBA might be conducted. But I said they go back unless there's special circumstances. So these are the special circumstances. So if the behavior in question is weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury, then the school can place the student in an alternate education setting for up to 45 school days without regard to whether the behavior is a manifestation of the disability or not. Those weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury are very, they're defined and they mean really specific things. So there's definitions around what is a weapon, what is serious bodily injury. So hitting somebody is not serious bodily injury. Like there's definitions for that in our penal code and in about what exactly is serious bodily injury. But if a student brought a weapon to school, even if the MDR said it is a manifestation, the school still could place a student in an alternate education setting for up to 45 school days. They don't have to. It's not they're required to, but they may if it involves weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury. The other time that you might not just return a student to their setting is sometimes the parent and the school might actually agree to a change of placement as part of modification to the behavior intervention plan. So if you say, yes, this is a manifestation, but in discussion in that meeting, the parents and the school team agree that they want to do some sort of change of placement as part of modification, that would be okay. If it was something that the school and the parents were agreeing to. Now, if they go to the manifestation and the answer to both questions is no, so we're saying this behavior was not caused by or a direct result of the disability, and this behavior was not caused by the school's failure to implement the IEP, then what happens is the regular disciplinary procedures that would be applicable to any student in the school who does not have a disability may be applied. The student can be disciplined in the same manner and same duration as a child without a disability. And the ARD committee basically determines the discipline setting. The ARD committee does have to look at, is the discipline setting that's proposed by the administrator, is the student able to receive FAPE in that setting? So the discipline can go forward just as it would for a student who's not disabled, but there's still a consideration that the ARD committee needs to consider. Can FAPE actually be provided for this student in that setting? And so then I'm going to talk a little bit about FAPE in the discipline setting. So FAPE in the discipline setting, the student has to be able to continue to participate in the general ed curriculum, even though it's in a different setting. And then you still need to be able to progress towards meeting the goals that are in their IEP. It doesn't have to be the exact same services in the same setting as before the discipline. The IEP may be adjusted to reflect what will be provided in the discipline setting. And just keep in mind that even if the discipline was something that if they were properly expelled for behavior that was not a manifestation, there's still obligations for FAPE to continue. So the schools still have this obligation to provide FAPE in a discipline setting, or even to students who have been properly expelled. So what happens if there's a disagreement in that manifestation? So what happens if, the school administrator, the school team says it's not a manifestation, and the parents feel like it is a manifestation? You can't reach mutual agreement. So what's going to happen in that situation is the district's going to implement the decision that the school-based reached and provide prior written notice. The parents would be able to request a due process hearing to challenge the MDR decision or placement. And if that happens in the discipline context, it's going to result in an expedited hearing. The student does remain in the discipline setting pending the decision of the hearing officer, unless the parent and school agree otherwise. So there is a procedure for due process with these disagreements over MDRs, that it is expedited hearing, but the student, typically the school might still send the student to the discipline setting while they're pending that result from the hearing officer. They don't have to. They could agree to do something else, but often that's what I see is what happens, in that they are able to do that, to provide the parents with the proper notice and have the student go there while they're pending the results from the hearing officer. All of these things about, though, when something is not a manifestation, what is the school allowed to do? If it's not a manifestation, the school may proceed with typical discipline procedures, but they don't have to. Sometimes I think there's maybe some confusion on school teams that, if the committee says, well, it's not a manifestation of the disability, that they must do exactly what they would do by this code of conduct or for any other student, but they don't have to do that. They are permitted to, but the committee might discuss in that meeting alternatives or other measures that make more sense for that student given their certain situation. So there's really no such thing as like a mandatory placement for a student in special education. You can be considering alternatives if the school and the family and everybody at the table is able to come up with something that makes sense for that student. The next section is about restraint procedures. There were some questions that came in initially about restraint procedures. So we have regulation in Texas around restraint that includes definitions and when you're able to use them. So restraint is defined as use of physical force or a mechanical device that significantly restricts the free movement of all or a portion of a child's body. Restraint may be used in an emergency, and an emergency is defined as a situation in which a child's behavior poses a threat of imminent serious physical harm to the child or others, or property destruction. And then restraint must be limited only in use in an emergency, discontinued at the point when an emergency no longer exists, must be implemented in a way that it protects the health and safety of the child and others, and not deprive the child of basic human necessities. So those are definitions for restraint that are in our current regulations, just taken word for word out of that. And then there's documentation requirements. So what should parents expect to happen on the day that there's an emergency situation and the child is restrained? So on the day that the restraint is utilized, one of the first things is that the campus administrator or designee has to be notified verbally or in writing. So whatever teacher or school staff person is involved in that restraint has an obligation to let the school administrator know on that same day. Also on the same day, there has to be a good faith effort to get in touch with the parents and verbally notify the parents about what happened. Written notification about the use of the restraint must be placed in the mail or otherwise, handed to the parent within 1 school day of the use of restraint. So on that day of the emergency, parents absolutely should expect that they're notified verbally, and within 1 school day that you should, that written notification. Although if they put it in the mail, it may be another day until you get it, because the regulation actually says it's placed in the mail within 1 school day. And then for what is actually on that written documentation that you should be getting, the written documentation has to say, the documentation also needs to go in the student's eligibility folder. So the reason I wanted to put that on here, that is in our regulations, that written documentation goes in the mail to the parents within school day, but it also has to go in the student's folder. And the reason for that is so that when the ARD committee is coming together for either an IEP review or an annual IEP or to develop or change a bit, that they have those, and they should be looking at those forms to inform decisions that you're making. So it's really good information about, like, is this behavior plan working? Is it not working? Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Are there, do we see a pattern of antecedents or situations in these restraint notifications that would help us make a better intervention plan? And so I put that in here because if your child has been involved in restraint and you are at a meeting, an IEP meeting, like an annual, and you're developing plans, you really want those to be looked at. There's a lot of information that could be valuable in those, and they should be in the student's folder, but sometimes, even if they're in the folder, are we looking at them during those IEP meetings? And it's really important that they are being looked at to inform development of the plan and the IEP. And then also that data, school districts report data on restraints to Texas Education Agency. So there's data collected at the state level regarding restraints. And then what has to be on that written notification. So when you as a parent get a notification that your child was involved in an emergency situation where a restraint was used, this is a list of everything that has to be on that notification. It could have more than this, but this is what is required. It has to have. So of course, the name of the child, the staff members that were involved, the staff members that were administering the restraint, the date, the time the restraint began and ended. So you're able to see how long did that emergency situation last, because remember, the restraint is supposed to be ended when the emergency situation no longer is present. And that's important data that can be looked at meetings too, like what's the duration of these incidents. Location, where did this occur? Nature of the restraint means, like, what type of restraint was it? What did it look like? So if the school's writing something on there, that might be, a lot of schools use training from a company called CPI, Crisis Prevention Institute, or a lot near the Austin, San Antonio area uses something called SAMA. These are providers that provide restraint training for the physical aspects of restraint. And so they have different terms for what they call various restraints. And so if they use that technical term, a parent might be like, well, what is that? What is a 2-person, whatever it's called? So you can always ask, like, well, tell me, like, what does that look like? Show me what that looks like. But the nature of the restraint box is really to describe, like, what kind of restraint, how was the student restrained? And then there's these next couple boxes I think are really critical for that data that can be reviewed at IEP teams to inform behavior plans or to inform IEPs. And so what was the description of the activity that the student was engaged in immediately preceding the use of restraint? And so that should be the activity, like, what was the setting, what was going on in the environment, what was happening there, what was it, math, was it reading, like, and what was going on? And then the next box is what was the behavior that prompted the restraint? So what was the behavior that the student was engaged in that was an emergency situation? And then, of course, what efforts were made to de-escalate the situation or alternatives to restraint that were attempted or considered or tried. So that might be, like some verbal de-escalation or physically like the staff member moving themselves to provide the student more space. And then they have to put on the written restraint notification document what kind of parent contact was made. So if they called you the day of, or what parent notification was done. All of that has to be on that written notification for a restraint form. Okay. So I want to go and share with you guys some resources in this appendix that can be really helpful. Hopefully when I click on them, you need to see something. So we'll see how this works. One of you will have to jump in and tell me, Christina, if it's not able to work. Part of the thing is I have two screens going too, so that might be
that might be the issue.
Yes. So let me see. If I click on it, okay, it's working?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
So this is an interactive flow chart that I wanted to share it with parents because I know schools use this a lot. This is a flow chart that is in paper version that was created by one of our educational service centers. Region 4 had created the paper version. Then another service center, I think this one's from 20, I'd have to look at the link, created this interactive one. So you can take it step by step. So the student has violated some sort of code of conduct. And so does the disciplinary, is it a change of placement? So let's say that the consequences, they're saying we're going to do DAP for 30 days. So yes, it's a change of placement. And then it would ask a question, well, was it weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury? Say no. And then you have an option to start over. So you can kind of use this flow chart to walk through like what's required or what's going to happen next based on different such questions. Is the behavior a manifestation? Let's say yes, it's a manifestation. Then it would tell you if the student should be returned to the placement and unless the condition like it's weapons or drugs or serious bodily injury. So that's just a flow chart that I know is out there that can be helpful. It's Region 19 did that interactive framework. You guys are probably pretty familiar, maybe a lot of you, with the legal framework, but the legal framework is where you can actually see the regulations and rules around things like restraint and removals, and you can see exactly what it says in regulation and statute. We do have a TEA page for discipline and school removals. Is that showing up for you guys? Seeing my screen.
I'm just right now seeing the PowerPoint slide.
Okay. I wonder why it worked the last time. I don't know. So TEA has a page on discipline and school removals that I'm trying to show you. Let me see. I've got an idea. Still the PowerPoint?
It is still the PowerPoint, but if you'll give me just a sec, I have an idea as well. Bear with me, guys. Okay, let me share it on my end. Okay, can you see it, Deanna?
Yes. So this is just, I wanted to just show them this link to the resource. There is a TEA page that links to all, a lot of different information from there about some of the information that we collect and also just so it's a place that you can see. There is a TEA page that does have some information about discipline and school removals. And those are just, a few resources that I wanted to share with you guys. And then I know there's a few more in there, there's a flow chart that is not an interactive one, but where you can see an entire flow chart all in one page. That's from Region 20. Of course, we have our Parents Guide to the ARD process and procedural safeguards. There's a section on discipline in there. Yep. Those procedural safeguards. The Parents Guide to the ARD process has a section on disciplinary removals that's written pretty parent-friendly language, and it's just a few pages. And then the other link is on TEA's website. There is a restraint sample form. Many school districts might not use the sample form. There's an English and a Spanish one. It's kind of in the middle page. But that is the minimum requirements of what has to be on a notification form. So many districts have their own form, but that sample form tells them, like, you have to have these things. And they're the things that I went over in the PowerPoint. So if those things are missing, then they're not providing what's required in the notice for restraint. Okay. And then I'm ready for some Q&A.
Okay. Let me get us back over here. Megan, are you ready? Do you need me to unmute you?
There's nothing quite like not having control of your own mic.
Well,
No, it's all good. All right, so let's get some questions and answers. I did post in the chat box earlier, and I want to let you guys know we do a call for questions at the end of each one of our TEA webinars so that you guys have an opportunity to submit your questions. These come from that. So if you have questions today, go ahead and submit those to the SurveyMonkey link that I shared in the chat box. All right, so I have, let's see, what is the TEA position on counting students sent home for part of a day or sitting in the office due to behavioral issues towards a 10-day rule?
So that's kind of related to the partial days of removal. And so if a student is not in their setting that they're supposed to be in their IEP placement setting, if they're sent home for half of the day or they're sitting in an office for a chunk of the day, then that should be counted as at least a partial day of removal. And so typically we're going to count half-day increments or full day. I mean, if it's 5 hours, that's a full day. If it's 2 hours or 3 hours, that would be a half day. Not getting into like, is it 0.75% of a day, but just half day, full days of removal. But it's a removal is really anytime, when a student, because of discipline, is not in their placement that they should be in. So if they, end up, if you get a call that says, come pick my kiddo up and it's noon, that's half day, of removal from their educational setting. So if those half days, chunks of time, those can add up towards the 10 days where you then need to start considering if those cumulative short-term removals are a pattern of removals that are a change in placement. So yes, those partial removals should count.
Okay, and then a follow-up question. What actions can or will TEA take to ensure that adequate and appropriate services, general and special education, are provided in-school suspension and a DAEP placement?
Okay, so a student can definitely be denied a free and appropriate public education due to a lack of appropriate services in a disciplinary setting. So if parents are concerned that a student is not receiving appropriate special education services while in a discipline setting, all the dispute resolutions options are available. The options include, mediation, dispute resolution, filing a complaint, and filing for a due process hearing. We have dispute resolution guidance on our webpage, on TA's special education webpage. There's dispute resolution handbook that can help parents understand what they need to do for any of those things. But basically how TEA would really be looking at, it would be around a violation of FAPE. So if your student's in a discipline setting and they're not receiving services, it's very possible that they might not be receiving FAPE, and you can go through the dispute resolution process to initiate, TEA to look at that through one of the methods that's available to you.
Okay, do charter schools have to follow the same rules and procedures for suspending or expelling a student who receives special education services as a public school?
Okay, so public charters, yes, charter schools have the same legal requirements as any other public school in terms of providing special ed related services. They must meet all of the federal and state requirements related to special ed that are in IDEA, our Texas Education Code, and our Texas Administrative Code. So public school districts and public charters are both have to follow the same regulations. Private schools are where it can be, it is where it's different. But when we're talking about charters in Texas, we're talking about public charters, and they do need to follow the requirements for IDEA, Texas Education Code, and Texas Administrative Code. They may not think that they do, but they do.
All right, excellent. Would TEA consider developing a guidance document on implementing positive behavioral interventions and supports at the individual and campus levels and applying the code of conduct to students with disabilities?
So I really thought that was a nice, would we consider it? Yes. So here's an initiative that's happening right now. Our technical assistance teams, which I'm a manager of one of those teams, have just launched a new initiative where what we're trying to do is create a series of frameworks or guidebooks that are from TEA's technical assistance team kind of out to the field. And what the point of them would be to kind of level set and tell districts, this is the framework, this is what TEA's framework is for talking about whatever the topic might be. And so we've just kind of launched this initiative, and we're in the development stage of figuring out the different topics that we want to release frameworks for and the order and the priorities. And so we are going to have at least 3 guidebooks or frameworks. We're calling them frameworks. I need to remember that we're calling them technical assistance frameworks. We want to launch 3 for the beginning of the 1920 school year. So in August or September, we want to have 3. So we have a long list right now that we're considering and trying to prioritize what 3, but I've definitely taken this one back about the idea of just positive behavior interventions and application of the student code of conduct for that team to consider as a framework at some point. I don't know that it will make it for one of the first 3, but we thought it was a really a good idea. And then once we launch the first 3, we're going to be also soliciting, like, you kind of have an idea now, we've put 3 out. These are what we mean by technical assistance frameworks. What other ones would people like to see, so that we can get some input from the field about what else, and from stakeholders about what else we'd like to see. And so potentially that's something like that may be coming. I would anticipate there'll be some things around behavior, but it may not be one of the first launch, and it may not be specifically about this exact one. But look for, they're going to be called TEA Technical Assistance Team Frameworks, coming soon. Next September is the project deadline for those for my team.
Perfect. There is another question that is again asking about guidance document, and it's for staff when they are making manifestation determination decisions.
So that specific one about a staff, that one is definitely on the list for a potential framework. Whether it'll be one of the first 3, I don't know, but we have heard that need, not just from whoever posed this question, but we have heard that need from other places, that there is just a need for more technical assistance guidance around what should happen in an MDR, like what should be discussed, kind of give it more a framework of what that should look like and how that process should run. So that one's one that's on the list as well for consideration.
All right. And then does TEA have plans to provide more information, resources, training, et cetera, to schools regarding providing appropriate social skills training, especially at secondary level?
So we don't have, there are no specific detailed plans currently for the agency to develop something in social skills. Again, it could potentially be a technical assistance framework at some point in the future. However, I would say that I know you guys had a webinar recently with Stephen Prater where he talked about the 10 networks that are launching for next school year. So in the 10 networks that are launching next school year, there's certainly a couple networks I can think of that are likely to have information about social skills. And so just kind of seeing what those are, we know what networks they're going to be, and we're working with various grantees to determine what exactly will be housed in those. So social skills information certainly fits in several of them. And then as these networks evolve over the years, they'll be built more and more information.
Okay, and then last question. What can a parent do if a school district is attempting to address unresolved and escalating behavior issues with a 504 plan and it is not working?
So I'm interpreting this question to mean that the student does not have an IEP. They're served through Section 504, and they have some accommodation plan or some intervention plan through Section 504, and the student's behavior continues to escalate or is unresolved. So in that situation, there's a couple things I would advise. First, of course, request a 504 meeting to work with the school to try to revise the plan. If that's not effective, or the parent believes that the student may require special education services, the parent has the right to request an evaluation under the IDEA. If you're working through 504 and things are not getting better, I would suggest that you strongly consider if you might need to request an evaluation under IDEA. Students not an accommodation plan or 504 plan not working would be a pretty strong indicator that the student, a 504 plan may not be sufficient for addressing their needs. So if the parent goes the route, if you say, I'm going to request an evaluation, my recommendation would be that you make a request for an evaluation in writing. You don't have to put evaluation requests in writing, but when you do, you have documentation of when you requested it, and it also triggers for the schools have to respond to that request within 15 school days. So just putting it in writing, which can be as simple as an email to an administrator or special ed director. And then if the concerns are about behavior, you might think about specifically requesting, making sure that the school understands that you're requesting as part of that evaluation a functional behavioral assessment. A functional behavioral assessment is really what's going to drive the development of a good behavioral intervention plan. And so what you don't want to happen is that an evaluation occurs, but in that evaluation they didn't conduct a functional behavioral assessment. The school should be doing that. But one thing I would say for a parent asking this question, if you're really concerned about escalating behavior, that one of the things you put in your request for evaluation is that full individual initial evaluation would include a functional behavioral assessment. Like I said, it should be including that already, but it might be helpful if you know that that's one thing specifically that you want. Another possibility, if the parents are not wanting to go the route of a special education evaluation and they really want to work through 504, that you could talk to the 504 committee about getting a consultation from somebody who has some level of behavioral expertise. So that could be an LSSP, licensed specialist in school psychology, who supports that school district or campus. It could be a behavior specialist who the district employs. It could be a board certified behavior analyst if the school district has somebody like that. So those people could come in and do a consultation without having to necessarily do an evaluation under IDA, if that's something that the family wanted, if you wanted to kind of go that route of trying to continue to work through 504 for just better, creating a better plan under 504. Those folks can do consultations and can be helpful in coming up with ideas or brainstorming. So that would be what I would recommend for a family who's served on the students has a 504 plan and the behaviors are escalating or not being resolved.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you for answering these questions. We really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you. I'm sorry for my technical issues. I thought it would be so much easier than it was to just click on some links. So I apologize for not having figured out how to do that.
That is okay. We were having some technical issues on our end. So, it happens. So it's all good. Thank you so much, Deanna.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let me, right here. Margiana, are you about ready? Got about 2 minutes before the Spanish version.
Christina, do we want to go ahead and do the final or the reminders for the next webinars and the call for questions?
Yes, thank you. Let's do that.
Sure. Okay, so we have 2 more collaborative webinars with TEA that are scheduled. We have progress monitoring. That's going to happen on Tuesday, March 26th at 12:15 for English and Spanish 1:15, and that's Central Time. And then we have one over extended school year services, April 30th. Again, that's a Tuesday at 12:15. We do need your questions for these TEA webinars, and we do ask that you submit them ahead of time. So we have the SurveyMonkey link listed up here on the flyer. Put it in the chat box a couple of different times. If you have questions regarding progress monitoring or anything else that you would like TEA to consider answering on the webinar, go ahead and submit those. The final day to submit questions for the March webinar is February 28th. So get those in the next 2 days. And then join me on March 5th. We're going to do Speak Up, Empowerment Through Effective Communication. So that one is next Tuesday, March 5th, again at 12:15 Central Time. And that one is with me. And then in April, that's going to be a disability rights webinar with Ms. Colleen Elby. It's What's Next? And it's the legal options for parents when an ARD meeting was not enough. So go ahead and save the dates. Join me next Tuesday and then save on your calendar the webinar for April with Colleen. Here is our information. If you would like to get a hold of myself or Christina, feel free to grab those email addresses and send us your comments. Let us know what you want to see us do webinars over, anything else that you have questions on. You can go to our website and get all of our resources that are shown in our statewide webinars, and then join us on Facebook. You guys have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us, and we'll get started with the Spanish here in just a few moments.
Thank you, everybody.